Welcome back, everybody. I am, of course, Sinan Schwarting of the Late Stage podcast, and I am very glad to be back with everyone this week. Just a great episode incoming. Of course, I'm a little early. Folks who are very perceptive will note that I just dropped an episode not very long ago. And in fact, that's true. But just with all the news in the news cycle right now to talk about, obviously there's too much to cover. I think if I waited any longer, there'd be too much for a single episode. And I have some great interviews already done for this episode. And one of them in particular is so relevant to the material that we're dealing with this week that I felt like I had to get this thing out ASAP. Of course, I'm going to be covering all the continents as per usual. I've got special guests lined up, especially for our Europe component of the episode. And I'll get into all of that. I guess let's dig into the table of contents for the week. No corrections from last week, which I'm, I suppose, proud of. As far as what we're going to cover this week, first of all, we've got to talk about the United States. We've got to talk about all the court cases, especially obviously the ruling on Kyle Rittenhouse. And kind of, as I like to do, that's something that most of the media is already talking about plenty. I like to focus on news stories that are not getting enough attention. So, I'm going to try to take a bigger perspective on that and connect it to some of the words of Supreme Court Justice Judge Coney Barrett and some of, what she said about the legitimacy of the court and people's perception of it and how it ties into this. I'm going to then sort of swing to some other racism in this country, and in particular, some stuff on the immigration front. A lot of promises have been made by the Biden administration and Democrats about doing more on the immigration front. And so, there's some bad news. It's not necessarily on Biden, but it doesn't speak well for the future of what can be done regarding immigration. And from there, I'm going to segue from, speaking of Biden, his health and how we shouldn't really be too focused on that kind of stuff, how it's a sort of superficial politics that delves into that. And then we're going to go into Turkey. And I have a fantastic guest, John Okar, who, find his info here, and I'll give it again going into our interview and throughout. But he's coming in to talk about Turkey. And speaking of health, it's a fascinating situation down there where rumors of the Prime Minister Erdogan's health keep popping up, and his maybe even death. And just, what the meaning of that is, why it's happening there, how it could happen, and what the ramifications of it are. And he's a fantastic guest. He's certainly always welcome to talk about whatever he wants, but specifically, I think his knowledge on Turkey and Turkish politics is second to none. He's very well qualified to be here. From there, we're going to move on to the story I talked about last week between Belarus and Poland. And I got, like I promised, my friend, Polish friend, who's also well qualified in the realm of journalism, to come in and talk a little bit about, like I said, that situation at the border and what's being done. Moving from Europe over there, we're going to probably dive into Africa. We have talk of Burundi and some sanctions being lifted, which is never necessarily a bad thing, but how it might reveal some hypocrisies as far as the sort of threats of sanctions elsewhere. Then we're going to talk about potentially good news in Sudan. We introduced our first episode with some bad news regarding Sudan, and the sort of blue profile picture people used last year to talk about a problem in Sudan and how we maybe have dropped the ball on it, and they've slid back into coups and trouble. But there's maybe some good news on that front, maybe not. We'll dive into that a little bit. Finally, we're going to talk about South and Central America. First of all, there's talk of severe droughts in Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, which are troubling on various fronts, economic and, of course, more importantly, on human impact. And then we're going to talk about Panama, some good news. No spoilers on that front. And then finally, we're going to wrap things up with Asia this week. There is some good news as far as Peng Shuai, a story that had lots of mystery and intrigue, perhaps coming to an end with some good news. And then finally, maybe some bad news in Japan regarding COVID policy and a lack of direct healthcare, which is surprising in a country that has very good and affordable healthcare. So perhaps some mismanagement. Anyway, beyond that, we're going to return to the weird of the week with some strange tales from the United States conservative movement. But yeah, besides that, let's dive right in. There's so much to talk about. I don't really want to waste any time. First of all, we have to talk about some sort of late breaking news. The two men who were accused of murdering Malcolm X were exonerated. It brings into question our judicial system, which is going to be a theme this episode. It brings into question what it takes to get justice in this country. There's been a recent Netflix documentary. It was called "Who Killed Malcolm X?" I needed to look that up. Sort of a docu-series, and there have been a lot of true crime shows and podcasts and the like that have brought eyes on certain cases, and it's even brought justice to certain people. And so this may have been another case of it. Who Killed Malcolm X was a Netflix docu-series that raised lots of questions as to who it was that, as you can imagine, killed Malcolm X. And sure enough, the two men who were serving life in prison were exonerated just recently. So that's, I think, a good segue into what we're dealing with this week regarding the justice system. As I said earlier, the story of Kyle Rittenhouse is one that's being discussed everywhere. It's certainly not underreported, which, as folks know, that's what I like to focus on, are the stories that are underreported. So rather than sort of go on about what was obviously a flawed case, last episode I showed a clip of the judge talking about Black folks in a way that sounded like it was sort of straight out of the 30s rather than 2021. And I don't mean the 2030s. I mean, unless we backslide, which things, it's not impossible apparently. But no, the judge didn't rule on the case. Obviously the jury did, but he weighed heavily on the proceedings. He brought into question who gets to be a judge, how they get to be a judge, how our system rewards these types of people and gives them these long sort of tenured positions, essentially, where they arbitrate over people's lives and well-being. And here's a case which sets incredible precedent as far as empowering people to show up to protests armed and then claim self-defense when they've angered everyone around them for doing such. It really brought for me back to a story not very long ago, where Judge Amy Coney Barrett, recently appointed by Trump under very questionable circumstances, a judge position stolen from Obama by a Senate that was acting out of line. Most people have already posited. And so what she said, importantly, this was at the christening of a building at the University of Louisville building named after Mitch McConnell. She claimed, and pardon me for reading, but it's a quote: "My goal today is to convince you that this court is not composed of a bunch of partisan hacks. Judicial philosophies are not the same as political parties." Again, Mitch McConnell, who had use politics to get her onto the court, the Supreme Court, was sitting next to her as she delivered the speech, unironically. And importantly, just after that, they sort of systematically went about attacking Roe v. Wade and have successfully created this provision in Texas that's sort of actively beginning the process of undermining Roe v. Wade nationally. And one can't help but wonder what she meant by that. How could anyone not view the Supreme Court as being highly politicized? And when you see like this recent case of the judge with Kyle Rittenhouse, how that's sort of spread out around the country, it's hard to imagine these are people, these are human beings presiding over cases. And they're going to be pulled by their conscience and by their politics and ideology. And in a world of hyper-partisanship, this might be a real thing. This might be an issue, if the foundation of people's core beliefs is trending away from democracy on a certain side of the political aisle and away from plurality, openly hostile towards diversity as it pertains not to thought, right? They need a space at every table when it comes to diversity of thought, but when it comes to actual people's background, Tucker Carlson's openly fantasized about a white ethno-state now at this point. Perhaps that's a dramatic take on it, but he's certainly spoken about how it shouldn't be held against them if they want that, right? We're at a very interesting time, and the courts being doubted by most. It's not ideal. It's not a great situation, but it's hard for people not to view them with some level of scrutiny, with some level of fear about politicization and how one's view can alter the court proceedings in any case. So yeah, this Kyle Rittenhouse court case has brought, I think, the entire United States judicial system into question for at least for this next generation of people coming up. And that's going to add a political element to the next generation, you'd imagine, of US politics and how we view the courts and how politicized they become. So it's not going to get any better, you'd imagine. And so to Judge Amy Coney Barrett, who feared the politicization of the courts, you were step one in like the demise of any sense of neutrality that even I think folks in the center had about this. So it's not going to get any better from here, I don't imagine. Now, on Monday, Ahmaud Arbery's case is going to be ruled on. So this isn't going to get any better, one imagines. You hope for the best, but I think at this point, it's hard for anyone to be too hopeful when it comes to the U.S. justice system. I hope to get a great guest on this topic someday. I don't know where to begin, even looking for one. They'd need a law background and extensive knowledge there, but I'm going to continue on because this next story, speaking of racism, just today, I came across this story, and it was by Aida Chavez in The Nation. And the court Parliamentarian has come into question a number of times for blocking reconciliation bills under various political premises. And her background, her name is Elizabeth McDonough, and she has specifically cited immigration in rejecting certain reconciliation bills, as sort of overreach, political overreach, and specifically citing them as not appropriate elements of budget reconciliation. And now it's felt odd for her to single out specifically immigration as something that's over political in that context, because these bills are full of various political agendas that depending on your viewpoint, you could call too political and not economic enough, or whatever sort of, however it is she framed that. But so what's now coming into light is her background. And Aida Chavez did a great job of framing her background. So she was apparently not Aida Chavez, I mean, Elizabeth McDonough. She was a deportation prosecutor for the INS, the Immigration Naturalization Services here in the United States. And so her job was to have immigrants be deported. Pretty much her job was to sort of especially focus on deporting individuals. Like she was the one dredging up cases and doing the casework to get folks deported as the prosecutor. So, you know, already there's been a lot of debate about whether the parliamentarian and unelected position should really be in a place to be making like the final yay or nay on huge bills that government appointed elected officials are trying to pass. And now we're finding out about a possible conflict of interest. So, I think the role of the parliamentarian has never had the amount of attention that it does right now. But the parliamentarian is now in a position where they could really set the Biden administration and Democrats back quite a bit. You know, I think the kind of Latin vote has been teetering. Democrats have not made a very concerted effort to court the Latin vote in various places, bar a few swing states, you know, which seems disingenuous just given that sort of political nature. But so on top of that now, we see Democrats backsliding on immigration and maybe not pushing hard enough because of a parliamentarian, an unelected official who has a conflict of interest, nixing efforts to do so. So the Biden agenda and Democrats could really be set back by this woman whose background is murkier and murkier the more we learn about her. And meanwhile, instead of focusing on these very important stories, the press seems very focused on Joe Biden's health. He went to get a regular checkup, and it was sort of a normalization of, you know, they got the thorough documentation of his health. He got he was basically put under for a limited amount of time. And Kamala Harris was president for a short time. So the U.S. had its first acting female president. His colon, I forgot the colonectomy or whatever that process is called of having it checked out. But anyway, supposedly he's doing okay. And why is this news? Supposedly because when Trump did it, there was this whole Trump, you know, this silly, he's the healthiest president in the United States. He's the healthiest human being ever, you know, sort of farcical treatment of that process. And so, like, because it had resumed normalcy, this was somehow significant. Now, should it have been? Maybe not, right? Like, we have these very aging politicians, and so one could be concerned with their health, and their health is often weaponized against them, as we saw against Hillary Clinton when she was sick, as we saw against Bernie Sanders when he coughed a couple times during the primary. And of course, Joe Biden's health and age have been brought into focus by his opposition quite regularly too. When I was supporting Bernie Sanders, I remember worrying very actively about his longstanding health and his age. But one can't imagine not knowing about their health. One can't imagine going days without knowing about the well-being of the president of the country. But so let's imagine for a moment that was happening. Let's imagine there were 4, 5, 6 day stretches where we didn't know where Joe Biden was, if he was alive, if he was healthy. And rumors were sprouting up all over the internet in circles about, oh, I know a nurse who works at a hospital who they've been treating President Biden and he's looking deathly ill. Imagine a world where that was possible, where we didn't have media cameras on the president at all hours. This is a reality in Turkey. And 2 weeks ago, in my sort of soccer football group chat, Beşiktaş is my club. I support a Turkish club. And I am half Turkish. I tend not to touch Turkish subject because of that status. I grew up here in New York City. Turks always treat me as sort of less than Turkish because of my background. I talk about this with John Okar a little bit, so I don't want to rehash it or anything. But this felt curious to me. How could a country not know about the well-being of their president to this extent? And so I brought John Okar in to talk about how odd it could be that the entire country of Turkey could not know about the well-being of their president, if it really signals perhaps some actual health problems. I mean, President Tayyip Erdogan Recep Tayyip Erdogan is getting up there in terms of his age, much like Joe Biden. But so beyond that, though, I questioned the need for these kinds of rumors and the rumor mongering, and if it was kind of wishful thinking to the extent that we often saw with Trump, folks kind of hoping maybe this is it, maybe he's really sicker than we thought. And it seemed like he maybe was, in fact, with coronavirus for a while. But, if this was sort of tactical in any way, and it seemed to me that it wouldn't be, that opposition to Erdogan would want to beat him electorally, democratically, and wouldn't want any asterisks or clouds of doubt over why he lost, which a health issue would be, rather than focusing on the politics. Massive inflation. The Turkish economy has been struggling for years, and people say, oh, well, who isn't now with inflation? No, this is a problem that predates global inflation by quite a bit. Turkey's economy has in particular struggled in ways that you'd think it wouldn't need to, given its role between the United States and Russia as a sort of geopolitical pawn that they all want to flatter into alliances perpetually. So government mismanagement has been a real issue in Turkey, and in particular economic. So you'd think opposition would want to defeat him on that alone, and that this health stuff would be more of a kind of unwanted distraction. So then you start to wonder, maybe is this a realization by some in his party that they're losing power, and to add murkiness to the waters? Could this be 4D, 5D politics at work? Which you start to already venture into the realm of conspiracy theory just by the very nature of this weird situation. So anyway, I didn't know who else to talk to about this. I personally don't know anything about it myself, certainly not enough to talk about it in detail. So I brought in John Okar, an expert on all things Turkey and economics, although that's not particularly relevant here, perhaps, to talk about this exact situation. And without any further ado, I'll show you our fantastic interview. Yeah. With me today, I am so lucky to have this guest who I could have had on about any number of subjects, but luckily I think I got the ideal subject for him. With me today is John Okar. You can see I will put his Twitter info underneath here so you can follow him. But yeah, just an absolute honor to have him on the show. And we're talking about Turkey and a really fascinating news story. Now, I've already introed it generally for my audience, but without getting into too much detail, because, well, I mean, Turkey is a difficult subject for me personally. As a half Turk, I'm always like not Turkish enough for Turks, not American enough for Americans, and so I'm never allowed to have too complex opinions without getting into trouble with the real Turks out there. But I got a real Turk on the show this week, John Okar. What an absolute honor. What is going on with Turkey? How can you not know if your president is alive for 4 or 5 days at a time?
Okay, so Sinan, before we get to that, it's a pleasure to be on. I don't know, I think a lot of people would argue that I'm not a real Turk. I live in Switzerland, I grew up in the UK, but how interested I am, but it's great to be with you. Now, what kind of we're talking right about the recent rumorville around the president. I think the first thing to start off with is it's not a big surprise that everybody is interested, right, in the health of politicians. So let's make that as a starting point. I think that's true of everywhere in the world. It's also always been true. People have been interested in how their leaders are. Are they healthy? What is their mental health like? And that's unsurprising because politicians have a major impact on our lives. We give them a lot of authority, a lot of power. And with that power and with that authority, they can take decisions which will change our financial status, that will change potentially our health, the education of our children, will change our future prospects, all the way through to potentially whether we go to war and die. So That's a starting point. Now, in a country like Turkey, you take that to its absolute extreme, because Turkey has, for good or for worse, and this is part of the debate, given an extreme amount of power, absolute power, full executive authority to one person. And they've been in power for 20 years. And so, again, it is, I would say, reasonable, certainly, but I think you also have to expect that people will be interested in the health of the president. So that's I think, a starting point. What's been happening recently, though, is people have seen on now quite a few different occasions with their own eyes what appears to be failing health. And then I'll throw it back to you in a minute. We need to have a couple of caveats here. I don't think you're a doctor, right, Sinan?
No,
and I'm not a doctor. So I think you need to be, and we need to be, very wary of trying to diagnose somebody just by seeing 2 or 3 clips which might be out of context. That was also a big debate, were some of these clips in context, out of context. And I don't like it when someone comes on and says, I'm an MD and I saw this person and my professional opinion is that they have X. And
right.
That's not ethical. That's not on. But at the same time, if you saw a member of your family and they were falling asleep in the middle of conversations, or if they were doddering as they walked, or if you felt that they just looked off as a human being to another human being, you'd say, I think that person is a bit ill. And I think that's what's happening in Turkey, but it's happening writ large. And then, of course, the reason it's really exploded is, on the one side, you have this being spoken about online, you have a lot of debate about it. And on the other side, and what I found surprising, and we can talk about this as well, you have the communications directorate like just pouring petrol on the fire by putting out videos, and it's super weird. Like, look, here's the president walking. Look, here's the president trying to play basketball. And so you end up actually exacerbating this debate. And the whole country is all of a sudden talking about that. The last thing I'll say is, this is all in the context of a country that is just falling rapidly into what seems to be chaos. And so that, allied with, this story, means, there's going to be intrigue. And so that's why I think, particularly over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about this. It's not entirely new, though, remember. His health has been talked about a lot, but it's... this time it feels perhaps a little bit different. But back to you. Which part of that do you want to pick apart?
No, I mean, that was exactly the kind of info I was looking for. And I think what I will do is add a little context to that. Here in the United States, it's actually fairly common for the health of a politician to be kind of used against them by opposition. And it started with, I remember, Hillary Clinton during the election between her and Trump. And they were, she's lost it. She's senile, and she showed. I mean, she actually got sick at one point during the campaign, and they were like, oh, she's definitely on her deathbed, and they're like propping her up like that movie Weekend at Bernie's back, like really nonsensical stuff, and clearly kind of oppo tactics to try to swing the election and people's perception, whatever. But then during Trump's presidency, we started seeing stuttering and signs of decline, perhaps. And again, it was perhaps more like wishful thinking on the part of opposition. Of course, now with Biden, you're seeing the same. And again, mostly opposition pointing out things. I mean, we've all had a little fun with him, with the flatulence with your the royal family over there. I guess you're not in England anymore, so that's fair game, right? Who doesn't want to fart on the Queen? No, I'm kidding. With that said, with that sort of American U.S. context, this situation in Turkey is clearly different. And you mentioned them bringing him out to play basketball and like sort of staging him. And even then, he looks kind of like he's teetering a little bit, right? He looks like he is physically ill. And just like the notion that someone could sort of be gone for 4 or 5 days, given his position of prominence in Turkish politics, in society, I mean, one can't imagine Biden, the public not knowing about where Biden is mentally or physically for I mean, 2 days at longest, right? So there is a sort of unique situation there that sort of differentiates it from anything we've had here in the United States recently, I think.
I mean, I don't know how unique it is. What we're seeing is a bit of a trend. Maybe it's just with an aging population and it's older people who vote. Around the world, there are just older leaders. And, part of aging is losing faculties, losing abilities. That's until we solve that. And I imagine that, we're going to get older and older, and pharmaceuticals will get better and better, and doctors will improve. But that is something we see around the world. Now, with Tayyip Erdogan in particular, he's been in power for 20 years. It's an extremely tiring job. I would anticipate that part of the next electoral cycle, again, depending on who the opposition comes up with, which is one of the reasons, one of many, why I think Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu shouldn't be the candidate. He's actually older than Tayyip Erdogan. Mm-hmm. I think one of the issues will be about youth versus now the old guard. The new guard coming in to replace the old guard. So I can imagine it's a conversation that will continue. But it's also to do with Turkey facing now just numerous challenges. And this is sort of what you've seen previously in America and other countries. At this time of need becomes the narrative. Do we want this leader who is tired, who is no longer on top of their game, who, probably should retire, who needs a rest? You can even make it almost patronizing, it is time for you to rest after 20 years of service to your country. And, time for new blood to come in and actually take on these challenges. Mm-hmm. You see it in business, you see it all across, you see it in sport as well. It's time for someone to retire when they can't do it anymore. Right. I can see that being a major narrative in Turkey because, honestly, you have to deal with this economy. You have to deal with, more broadly, a country that has been in decline now for a decade, even if the government doesn't accept that. And so this will inevitably be a part of that narrative. I did like, though, what you said about Trump and sort of wishful thinking. I do think the opposition needs to be very careful that they don't just think that there is some inevitability to the decline of the president, and that we're just going to win the next election, and part of that is because Tayyip Erdogan could disappear at any moment. First of all, that has been something we've heard for the last decade, at least. All of the rumors, by the way, and they're always rumors, and you've probably heard it. Yeah, my best friend's mother's aunt's, best friend's sister is actually a nurse in this hospital, and he went there for a treatment. Mm-hmm. And then that becomes gospel truth. Now imagine that on the steroids of WhatsApp groups and the families in Turkey. Now I can imagine there's going to be a lot of rumor mills that happen over the coming years, and I'd always take that with a pinch of salt. And I think that the opposition should talk about, we need vigor, we need youth, we need energy, we need passion. I would be wary of turning health into a major driver in that conversation. Just let him do his own talking, if you know what I mean. That sort of is obvious. People have their own eyes. I think they can make their own judgment about who is more, on it, who is more with it, when you sort of put them up against another. If you make that too much of the narrative, I think you lose a lot of the argumentation that's actually going to win the next cycle of argumentation that eventually leads to the elections.
See, this, I think we're starting to touch on, for me, what might be the important point here. And so a friend of mine asked, I heard that Erdogan's maybe sick, people haven't heard him in a while. Could it be possible? Are you happy about that, as theoretical opposition? And of course, no, you're never happy about somebody dying or being ill. That's not sporting, if you will. But beyond that, no, I think politically you want him to be defeated electorally, in the realm of politics, right? You don't want it to be sort of an asterisk or this the party sort of faded out because X, Y, the leader passed away or whatever. You want it to be sort of one ideologically on the battlefield of politics, right? So on that hand, as I was sort of fleshing out my answer to that question, it dawned on me, could this kind of be a cop-out? Could it be a recognition by Erdogan or his party that they're kind of losing grasp, and we should probably talk about the economic struggles that he's kind of overseeing now, not to mention geopolitical with sort of the Kurds and US and Russia and all the sort of things that are kind of ever present, perhaps, honestly. But could this be a recognition that like the party needs a new direction, and rather than him losing, which again, you sort of mentioned, people are starting to view as inevitable, which is a very dangerous way of viewing things. Could this kind of be the recognition that they need to make a move towards youth or towards in a new direction, and kind of giving him the off ramp? Is there any way that this is tactical?
I do not buy that. No, I imagine that there are voices, quite lone voices within the party, who are trying to say, look, we might not be able to get through this next cycle. But first of all, I don't think there is an heir apparent. So there isn't an obvious person who you'd go for if you're looking from their side. Secondly, I don't see how the way in which this is unfolding with the responses that come from the communications directorate, and in general, the sort of the attitude around the AKP, say, Twitter sphere, I don't see that there is any other game in town except Tayyip Erdogan. He is the AKP. He is the AK Party. He, I think, electorally outstrips the AKP. So I think that a lot of people are tied up in his political success. So in a way, they need him to be able to keep going, because without him, I'm not convinced that that is actually a party anymore. It's riven. If you remember, if you go back to the start of the AKP, it was a coalition of numerous different groups. Mm-hmm. Even now, it's almost literal coalition, not an actual coalition. It's an alliance, but between two parties. And that has really pulled the AKP to the right. But even within the AKP, you can see there are different constituencies. There are different factions. The one thing that really drives all of that along is Tayyip Erdogan. And I think they need him. They need him electorally. So I don't think it helps them in any way. And that's why they try to put down any conversation of health. And it's, by the way, I don't buy in going online and being like, somebody's died and trying to start rumors when you have zero evidence for that. And I think everyone should be, by the way, really careful about talking about this online. And I'm trying to be super careful now talking about it as well. Yeah. At the same time, taking them into custody for that, that was a bit random, right? And it speaks to this not being something that, in my mind, the government really would want to talk about. Mm-hmm. I don't think it really helps them in their narratives, which they need, which is we are building to 2023. And I think their new narrative is going to be, yes, it's going to be really difficult this year, but just trust us. It's all for the good of Turkey in the long term. That's the bet that they're making, that by 2023, which is also why I don't think they'll have an early election, because right now I don't think they'd win. I think that that's what they're gambling on. But I could be proven wrong by that. But your initial question, I don't think this is some kind of trick. I don't think this is some kind of way to push somebody out gracefully. I think that this is quite an existential battle, because he is the leader. He is the only game in town, my view.
That's fascinating. No, that it's an interesting, I think, phenomenon. And going back to where you sort of started us out, we do live in an age with a lot of aging politicians where there's a gap between like old media and new media and how people are receiving politics and perceiving them, obviously. So, I mean, obviously the ideal scenario would be to get this sort of next generation involved and politically active, and that would solve all the problems. But of course, that's much more difficult to achieve than it is to sort of spell out like this. But I guess real quick, before we leave, because I mean, that pretty much covers that subject. And I think you're absolutely right. It's sort of silly rumor mongering, probably wishful thinking. And I only ask the sort of tactical thing because it just crossed my mind that if this is the end of this sort of era of Turkish politics, in a lot of ways, it would be a more ideal ending. Like, I don't know about your personal background with the country. My mother fled Turkey during a coup, in the late 60s. And I think so many of the diaspora has had family leave Turkey under far worse circumstances. So for an era of politics to end sort of gracefully, one way or another, would be ideal. And obviously, this is not that. That wouldn't be it for him to sort of die and under mystery and the clouds of chaos and all that. So, I mean, I'm looking forward to the next cycle of elections in Turkey. I'm hoping for some productive conversations going on there.
So first of all, it's interesting. We have quite a few parallels, although mine is a little bit later. My dad, mum and dad. My dad was fairly left. I would say very left wing. I can't remember exactly. Was it Maoist or Trotskyist? I think it was Trotskyist. And after 1980, that was not a good way to be with the military coup. So actually, again, after a coup, he moved to London to work at the BBC, and we went shortly after. So it's quite parallel experience. And then
very much.
We actually left after 2016 because we just couldn't deal. I just could not deal with any more of the drama. That drama from 15, 16, it was making me anxious. So I think a lot of people who leave under difficult circumstances. But now I feel, and I'm going to get to your question now, I feel terribly sorry for people who are in Turkey. A lot of my friends, a lot of my family. And that is the context in which we go now to, I hope, elections. If you look actually at some very savvy people, for example, I think it was Selim Korus saying, there is an assumption that there's a deal that all of us have made, sort of, with the state, that we're going to get a chance to vote this guy out. They might renege on that. I think we need to be ready for at least an attempt to say, no, actually, let's not have a vote for security reasons, for, I don't know, all kinds of crazy situations which we haven't perhaps even prepared ourselves for yet. So there is that, and we need to be wary of that. I happen to think that the AKP right now is electorally eminently defeatable. I think you probably have to beat them by a wide margin because of the nature of how elections happen in Turkey. And I've been an observer on many occasions. You need observers everywhere in the country, not just in the cities. And I think that has to be something which I know the opposition is looking at, but everybody across the opposition needs to be super careful, particularly in the East, because again, we know that there's going to be a security issue there as well. So it needs to be a big victory. I think that winning electorally also means winning politically from now. And I have to say it again, that means letting the health speak for itself. If that's an issue, that's something between the president and the electorate. I don't think you need to really make hay with that because it's just so apparent, really. For me, what is now essential is building the case. So first of all, highlighting everything that's going wrong. That's the easy part. And to be honest, right now, that's not too difficult, right? We've had just a series of economic missteps. We're now looking at what appears to be the most irrational set of decisions in terms of monetary policy that almost anyone can remember. I spoke to a good friend in London who's in finance who's saying, this is, with the possible exception of Brexit, one of the first voluntary economic collapses they can remember, often by accident or because of things that you didn't want to happen, a crisis will come. We literally made this one happen, like intentionally. Just like, let's have a crisis, which is mad. So you have that. You have the chronic mismanagement. You have what appears to be very poor decision making at all levels of the state. Just bad investments in terms of the infrastructure, and you see that through all of these guarantees, which honestly, they need to be restructured, those guarantees, because they're a long-term nuclear bomb in the financial system within Turkey and within the broader sort of way that the government's going to be financing itself over the coming years. And that's something that if the opposition ever wins, we have to have a very frank conversation, I think, with various finance organizations about how to do that. So you have that context that you need to talk about. Then I think slowly but surely building the positive agenda and ensuring that the AKP can't rip apart at the coalition of the opposition. And that includes with the HDP. It includes with all kinds of marginalized groups, including those who used to be in the AKP, but no longer feel they have a home there. I need to say this, there's been a lot of debate about Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu saying, I want to I want to make peace because of previous sins and so on. And I'm just thinking, look, this is strategy. 35 to 40% is going to vote for the opposition, whatever they do. I mean, they could come out and start swearing at us, still going to vote for them, honestly. You win elections by getting the 20% in the middle, because the other side has 40% as well. It's the 20% in the middle. And sometimes you have to piss off the 40% that you already have to get the 20% that you don't. And you need to make them offers. And you know this. You're in America, right? In America,
I was about to say.
It's crazier because you have the Electoral College. It's just a few swing states who get all the promises, who get all the attention. And that's possibly unfair. Maybe democracy shouldn't be like that. Maybe I should be more valuable. But you know, who I'm going to vote for is fairly obvious. The opposition needs to focus on getting that middle 20%, whatever it takes. And that means, you know, talking about one set of things, you know, the economy, how they're failing and how the opposition will be better, and uniting the opposition around that narrative, not necessarily talking about rumors, talking about, honestly, things which don't really benefit the opposition. Give the government more ability to say, look at them and their fake news and the rubbish and the bullshit that they throw out.
Exactly.
This is what they're like. You know, we're the real power brokers in this country. Don't give them that. And as I say, if somebody is ill, if people are clever enough, right? You see that. You see it with your own eyes. You don't need anybody to say it on your behalf. So that's how I would view this entire thing. Anything else, Sinan? Do you want to talk about Besiktas?
No, I mean that was perfect.
Another time, maybe.
Besiktas, yeah, that's somehow an even more depressing time. No, that's not true. not in the grand scheme of things. Although,
yeah, they're not going to be helped by any of this that's happening.
No,
you know.
Right? Yeah, Turkish football will absolutely be destroyed by the financial side of all of this. But no, I mean, again, thank you so much for coming on, John. It's so great to get an informed perspective on this. As for the whole real Turk thing, you know, that's sort of a running joke I have with a number of my Turkish friends, because I was advertising a bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich that I was eating, like in a group chat, and they're like, "Oh my God, you're eating pork! You're not a real Turk at all." And so it became a kind of like hashtag not real Turk. But yeah, I mean, nonetheless.
Yeah, just as a closer, then maybe. I mean, I am often asked. You know, anyone who's watching this presumably either follows you or follows me. You know, and I get asked. You know, you live in Switzerland. You're clearly British, or you know, they don't know maybe that I'm British, but my English is good enough to indicate that I grew up somewhere else.
Right.
It's like, why do you care so much about Turkey? Like, just leave it behind. You know, you could have a perfectly peaceful life. And the problem is, well, first of all, it's fascinating, genuinely. Second, I mean, my family's there, and you know, it's my country, and I care. But really, when it comes down to it, you sometimes can't leave something behind, no matter how much you think, whether you're real Turk, fake Turk, British Turk, American Turk, whatever it is, it's always Turk. And I don't think you can throw that away. I think 100 years could pass, and I would hope that, you know, I have grandkids who would be fighting battles from God knows where, you know, if the earth hasn't burned by then. Right. So, you know, this is something that we'll be watching extremely closely. I think that all of the topics we've discussed today will be on the table for the next 2 years in different ways. Mm-hmm. I just hope that the opposition continues to get it right. And in all honesty, I hope the AKP keeps on getting it wrong. And so far, that is what's happening. But I do hope that that continues, because there is nothing to suggest that that will always be the case. We need to be, you know, we can never be complacent and think that, oh, we're just going to win. Which, by the way, I have to say, anyone watching this, I'm sensing complacency in the opposition because things are getting so bad. Nah, don't be complacent at all. You know, things could change very quickly. So I would suggest, as I said, keep a really sharp focus on getting out the narrative correctly, and that means don't get pulled into bullshit rumors. It's intriguing, and maybe for like a few moments it gets the heart beating and so on, but that isn't the ball game. The ball game is something very different.
And fittingly, that applies to American folks too, folks here who are interested in politics. It's pretty much the same story, right? You're seeing complacency and you're seeing slippage. Stay up on it. One final note, speaking of how we can't quite let go of, I do have a sweatshirt handy, just so folks know, this is our shared love.
I don't have anything, but
it's okay. That's a perfect way to end it. Thank you so much, John. It was fantastic to have you.
Cheers, man. And yeah, hopefully I can come back and we can talk about something more, I don't know, hopeful next time. Maybe Beşiktaş will have recovered a little bit from the downside. But it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope things are going well. For you, I think it's the morning. Clearly for me, it's nighttime. I don't drink vodka in the morning. Just for anyone watching, I'm not just a raging alcoholic.
Given the subject, I think it would have been allowed regardless. But
maybe solving the world's problems at the absolutely.
Exactly.
Cheers, man. We'll talk soon.
Thank you so much, man. It was really great stuff from John. He's so knowledgeable. It was such a great honor to have him on. And yeah, open invitation, of course. And now next up, in the last episode, I mentioned Poland and Belarus, a kind of odd confrontation between two sort of theoretical far-right, one maybe dictatorship, one democracy vis-a-vis Belarus and Poland, respectively. And a weird border conflict where Belarus is trying to undermine the EU under whose dictate we didn't quite know. So I had a friend of mine, a very well-versed journalist and well-practiced, vis-a-vis Jakub Krawczynski. I forgot how he pronounced it. Krawczynski. Anyway, he'll show you how to pronounce his name. And without any further ado, Jakub, take it away. With me today, I have a very special guest. In my last episode, I alluded to the sort of border issues between Belarus and Poland, and more broadly, Belarus and the EU. And I have a fantastic guest with us today, very informed, with a great background in journalism. But I don't want to, steal the mic here from him. So, Jakub Krawczynski, is that a good pronunciation?
Well, for an English-speaking person, I think give you the benefit of the doubt. Yeah,
give us the real one. Let's hear it.
Yeah. My actual pronunciation of my name is Jakub Krawczynski.
That sounds better.
Yeah, those ch sounds are really hard for English speakers. So yeah.
So yeah, say a word or two about like your journalism, like where people might have seen you in the past or where they can find you, and then let's dig into the story. But yeah, just say a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, all right. So basically, for the past almost 2 years, I worked in Wirtualna Polska, which is the biggest media outlet in Poland. It's an internet-based medium. And basically, I was an editor of the technology section. But I was involved in several other sections of the entire website as well. So I did a lot of guest columns commenting on certain social and political issues as well. So and this angle, even if I was covering some technological issues, I was also doing them from the socio-political perspective, sometimes. And so this is something very, this topic of the discussion for today is something that is really close to what I'm personally interested in, the angle. So that's about my journalistic credentials. Yeah,
and I should mention that like we've known each other for many years, and it's funny. Like,
Yeah.
you happen to be a fan of a rival of my favorite football team.
That's true.
But nonetheless, we've maintained good communications, no hostility between us. We're in the thick of a tough season now, but we won't go into that.
No.
But so yeah, because this really is like, I feel like we could talk so much about it. I mean, one of the main reasons I'm having you on, I really like the idea of having sort of regular folks on to talk about what the news feels like for them, and because these are these events in the media we hear about. And I remember living through the kind of Trump era, and I can only imagine what people would have thought living here in the United States was like during that time, with all the crazy stories coming out. And I think very similarly, that's probably true in Poland. I'm so, on the one hand, I'm very curious about that, but then also, and how it relates to the story. If there's any sort of, if living through that kind of a story, if you really feel it in any way, I don't know if you're near the border. I don't think you are, but nonetheless, let me leave you with that.
Yeah, so as far as living near the border is concerned, no, I do not live in the nearest vicinity of the border, but I live in actually the region bordering with the other region where this stuff is going on. It's actually not that far away from me. Like, if you probably measured the distance in a straight line, it would probably be like, I don't know, 200 miles, something like this, I guess. So I'm not exactly affected by it, on this level, but still, I guess, this is a multifaceted, basically situation, and the Poland in itself as a country has a lot of stuff going on, a lot of turmoil, galloping inflation, the ruling party using any opportunity, even this one, as a means to prop themselves up as a heroes, so there's a lot of pieces, and some of the pieces of the puzzle are a means to mask inefficiencies, inadequacies of the government and the ruling party. So even if I do not live in the immediate vicinity of the entire situation, but still, some stuff affect us as a country on several different levels. There's so much to it that I don't even know where to begin, man.
Yeah, and so I mean, first of all, like, for relativity's sake, I mean, the 200 miles you're talking about for someone who's like from the States, that's like the distance from where I am in New York to Boston, right? It's really not far at all. In fact, like, if there's like a weather event in Boston, we've likely felt it here in the city too. That's how close it is. But then even beyond that, like, what I imagine must be very complicated for you is that in this scenario, Poland represents the EU, right? Which the government has probably very regularly come out against, I would imagine, given the kind of politics that they represent, right? So it must be very weird for you. I mean, am I right? Yeah. Like, is that an added complication for you?
Yes, it is. So basically, in theory, we represent the European Union, but the thing is, our government wants to handle it by themselves, and even one sec, I'm gonna pull something up, but for later. But they do not want the external help of European Union, or at least they try to give this impression that they don't, and also they do not allow any journalistic presence at the border on our side, because on the Belarusian side, BBC or CNN are allowed, and this also creates something of an image problem, because of course our government wants, don't want, independent journalists to undermine anything that they do. I mean, on an image level, but on the other hand, it opens the possibility that anything coming from Belarusian side can be this, incriminating Poland, even if it's not true. But it's and there's also this. Okay, so basically, for example, there's been this famous Polish actress who worked for a state television, and she didn't mince her words. She described the border guards and the military as soulless killing machines or whatever, because there were some deaths. There were some even deaths of some children, and mistreating of those refugees and whatnot, like throwing around the, what you call it, like basically, one sec. I'm used to certain words.
No, by all means. Yeah,
oh yeah. So basically, there's been instances of some refugees, like women, pregnant women, who were thrown over the barbed wire and they miscarried. So, and that actress I was telling you about, who was employed by the state television, was fired after her criticism of this of this action, of these actions, and it's even more weird because I think somebody was trying to start a lawsuit against her and wanted her to be prosecuted. So it doesn't bode well for the freedom of speech, and yeah, so there's this aspect, and also there's another aspect that there's been talks by the French president Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. She's still an acting chancellor, and basically they've been in touch with Lukashenko, and not us, not our president, because our role, basically nobody takes us seriously any longer on an international level, and also our government was unhappy that both Macron and Merkel called Lukashenko, and basically they threatened him with even more sanctions, but on the other side, at least that's what some people working in the Euro Parliament described that Lukashenko basically wants to he has basically some demands that he wants to get fulfilled, and the EU feels that they shouldn't give in into anything that he wants, because this was create a discord or among the EU, etc., etc. So there's this, and but basically any serious talks that are happening, it's just they're happening without without Poland. But there's also this thing, because as of today, because I have so many cards being open right now that I can even keep track. But there's been some new development that Lukashenko basically after those threats of additional sanctions, he decided to deport some refugees from Iraq via airplanes. Because basically that's the beginning of the whole thing. Like
Right.
Lukashenko made illegal immigration possible as a retaliation after he was sanctioned. The whole country was sanctioned. Yeah. So
Okay.
now, after being threatened with even more sanctions, he decided to start deporting some Iraqi refugees or criminals or whatever, because there's probably lots of different types of people
Sure.
there. But he wants Poland to create a humanitarian corridor that would allow 2,000 refugees to pass to Germany. And this is what his talk with Merkel was about. So yeah, it's kind of complicated, and to further like complicate things, like also Belarus controls the distribution of oil, because they own certain pipelines there. And
Right.
for example, like 10 hours ago, there was a piece of news that like the transfer of oil was temporarily halted or whatever, supposedly due to maintenance, but probably something tells me that Lukashenko
Right.
wanted to to have his 5 minutes of fame, like
Look what I can do. Yeah.
trying to show them, yeah. And also to further complicate this, of course, it's impossible to have an 100% objective view of the situation, because the press is not allowed, and
Right.
like the Polish press is not allowed there. And also there's definitely some kind of a Putin involvement, but yeah, but we cannot truly verify to what extent like Lukashenko fulfills his agenda, or maybe he wants to
Right.
gain his favor or whatever. I'm not the one for base concrete judgments when I have little evidence, but it's probable, of course.
There's certainly a precedent, right? We can speak to that.
Yeah, of
Uh,
course.
that's
And
right.
but what I can tell you, man, that about the press, uh, they've been treated very badly. I mean, there were 3 photo reporters that they were, I guess, in the area in which they were allowed to do their stuff, because this was not some kind of a village, but it was not in the state of the emergency area, and but military stationed somewhere nearby, and one of the I think one of the reporters was from Czech Republic, but he was a photo reporter of the New York Times, and there were some other 2 like European photo reporters, and they were detained by the military. They were they were beaten, and stuff like that, because I guess just on this ludic level, the military saw some guys with beards, and immediately this image conjured of
The immigrants.
because in a rudimentary mind, beard means a terrorist or whatever,
Right.
So yeah,
I
and
guess like racial profiling, you could say, kind of.
yeah.
And so, what I was going to ask, and you've actually sort of answered this. Like, I understand the side of Poland, right? I mean, you have a government that's already anti-immigrant, and then you have the EU, which probably backs this because they've been, putting quotas on how many immigrants they want to let in. I know they've been giving money to Turkey to keep immigrants, right? So they've been kind of making these efforts to keep immigrants out. So I can see the logic of the one side. And my question was like, what's Belarus trying to get out of this? And I think on top of the general anti-EU sentiment and Putin like always trying to poke a stick, wherever he can, you also now have this sort of like pushback against sanctions, I guess, right? And but so
Yeah.
is there something Lukashenko hopes to really gain by letting immigrants pour in? Like what is he hoping that they're going to loosen sanctions because of these sort of aggressive actions on his part, or I guess like passive aggressive or whatever it is? Like what is that like, or is it just sort of like one-dimensional chess?
No, I think it's a lot deeper than just one-dimensional chess. I mean, like I said, it's impossible to say what version of reality is actually true, because we don't know to what extent Lukashenko is fulfilling any whims of Putin, and this whole anti-immigration situation is kind of good for the ruling party of Poland, because they can cement their most hardcore fan base, so to speak, in this, anti-immigration, routine, which is an effective means of doing so. And I'm really wondering if this entire situation is to some extent directed towards the ruling party, so that they could gain some additional favor. I mean, there's, it's certainly a possibility, but it would also be kind of weird to me if this was all that there's to it,
Yeah.
I don't know what Lukashenko's end game is actually. I mean, probably he would like those sanctions lifted, I guess. Although I don't know, I really it's hard to me actually. This aspect of it it's quite it's quite difficult to get to the bottom of it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating story. Whenever you have the interests of the EU and the interests of this current Polish government like intertwining, something must be crazy, something must be weird going on. And of course, it only makes it all the more mystifying that it's the the last totalitarian state of Europe that's involved on the other end of it, right? It makes this such an odd scenario. And you're absolutely right. I can only imagine that the sort of ruling party in Poland is certainly using this sort of anti-immigrant position that they get to sort of bask in, right? Because they have EU support to drum up nationalism and all the old, the things that anti-immigrant causes tend to drum up. But yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. Thank you so much for giving us the lowdown, Jakub. And please, keep us in mind, if this story evolves or whatever the next story coming out of Poland is, please, you could be our official Polish correspondent. The Polish correspondent.
Yeah, I would be honored. Of course, if there were some, I hope there's going to be more good news in the coming days, of course. But yeah, I'll be thinking about filling you in, with some more details as they come, because the situation is very dynamic. A lot of stuff can happen now in the coming days. So
yeah, no, it's such a fascinating story, honestly, and it really is. It's sort of like, in a lot of ways, it's like the heartbeat of global politics right now. You have these competing forces between authoritarianism and democracy, and then you have the competing forces of all of the people that have been sort of unsettled by the various wars we've started over the last 25 years. And by we, I mean specifically here in the United States, especially, right? But you guys have helped, right? We've all played a part. But so, it's such a fascinating thing to see how it's all culminating and playing with all the geopolitics that are afoot, But yeah, thank you so much again, Jakub. And please do stop by.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
So,
thank you so
thank
much,
you.
dude. Thank you so much, Jakub. Just great stuff. It's so fun to get the opinion of actual people living these stories in the news rather than just kind of reading the highlights from the papers here. But yeah, wild stuff over there. And obviously I hope for the best, most of all for the people involved, the immigrants especially. Now, back to Africa. In sort of bad news from Burundi, it's hard to say it's bad news. Basically, the United States is ending sanctions on Burundi, which in and of itself is great. I think sanctions tend to hurt people rather than the sort of regimes that they seek to hurt. That said, and I'll read a quote, and this is from exiled Burundian lawyer Armel Nyongere. He delivered this at the UN. He said, "Since Evariste Ndayishimiye, the new president elected in June 2020, took power, there has been a continuous regression. Many cases of forced disappearances, torture, assassinations. France sort of carried on from there a little bit, catching back in later on. He says France and the entire European Union should make the resumption of cooperation conditional on respect for human rights." Importantly, the sanctions imposed on Burundi were imposed on this current president Ndayishimiye's predecessor, who was found to have engaged in egregious human rights violations. But so this sort of uptick in human rights violations would be news, I think, to many, and I think that's probably the logic for why sanctions had been lifted, was the assumption that human rights violations had ceased. So without that being true, it raises to question whether these sanctions should be lifted. Now, again, like I said earlier, I think sanctions tend to hurt people more than regimes. That said, it brings, I think, a certain hypocrisy to light. Now, Antony Blinken has threatened via Biden sanctions on Nicaragua because of their sort of quote unquote irregular elections. Now, as bad as irregular elections may or may not be, human rights violations, disappearances, torture, murder are, I think, definitively worse. So I think you have to be even-handed with how you apply sanctions if you're gonna play that game. And one might argue you shouldn't play that game in the first place. But anyway, that's the sort of bad news out of Africa. There's some good news, however. I mentioned Sudan in my first episode as a sort of a bad example of sort of coup backsliding. A lot of attention had been given Sudan previously because of a coup that had dislodged democracy. And again, recently there had been a coup, and this one sort of flew under everyone's radars. No profile picture imagery or anything to recognize the plight of Sudanese. Now, what's good news, I think, in this case is ousted Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok was reinstated by Sudan's military after, again, he had sort of spurred on successfully mass protests around the country. And I think it forced the hands of the military coup leaders into bringing him back into the fold. And so that's theoretically good news, right? That's like the people winning versus the military dictatorship. On the other hand, the people are not entirely pleased. The leader of the coup's name is General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. And it was a sort of power sharing deal that was consecrated via live TV. And I think protesters feel like they don't want this military dictatorship to have anything to do with democracy. They don't want their hands on the levers of democracy. They don't want the potential for another coup to occur. And so it's not enough, supposedly, for the sort of mass protest that's taking place in Sudan to sort of subside. So we'll see what happens in the future. I'll try to keep an eye on that story, but positive signs, at the very least, a resumption of something closer to normalcy, re the democracy of Sudan. We'll see how that carries on. Now, moving on to Central and South America. A story, I mentioned in the very first episode of the podcast the fact that climate crisis is one of the main existential threats to humanity right now, and that needs to be focused on. And a story that's not getting a lot of attention are severe droughts in South America. The Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil region, and specifically the second largest river in South America, the Paraná, is suffering through severe drought. The lowest levels, the river has reached its lowest levels in 77 years, and it's a huge crisis. That river is a huge connector of grain transport to much of the world. Energy prices are going up because hydroelectric dams are struggling to provide enough energy. So I mentioned Saudi oil rates impacting inflation. This would be another sort of unintentional impact on the part of that, with hydroelectric dams not able to provide energy regionally there and oil prices up, it's just severely impacting inflation there and the economy. So my hearts go to the people of South America, yet another tough thing to deal with. I know the people of Brazil with their government mismanagement of COVID and just environmental degradation to boot. On to some better news. Panama is set to be the very first Central American nation to legalize medical marijuana. So 420 congratulations from the late stage Tribune and podcast team to the nation of Panama. Medicate responsibly. That's my official word from the podcast. Moving on to Asia this week. Continuing in the vein of good news, a lot of worries had gone to tennis player Peng Shuai of China. Former number one doubles champion had a Me Too, #MeToo moment where she called out, I gotta look up his name, Zhang Gaoli, former vice premier of the Communist Party in China. And he is not a part of the government now, but because of her sort of outing him for sort of sexual assault allegations, somehow she disappeared for about a week or so. And folks were very concerned, worried, tennis stars voicing concerns. But sure enough, she's been shown in public functions today in China. Hopefully that's the end of the story. And there's nothing amiss beyond just that. There's talk of video being edited and, there's still being larger concerns here, but let's hope for the best, obviously. And let's hope this was a non-story after all. One last story for the episode out of Asia. In Japan, a very controversial rule was made requiring folks to recover at home from COVID, and apparently many deaths have been a product of this. People not getting medical treatment, after 10 days of having COVID is like the second wave, and sometimes people are hurt by that second wave far more than they are by initially getting COVID in the first place. Apparently, a lot of deaths occurred in Japan as a product of people being sent home to recover and not being watched, which in a country with a very modern, affordable healthcare system should not be the case, and is, I think, a clear indication of government mismanagement. So, again, hearts go out to the folks impacted by that. And hopefully the government of Japan will have learned from this, and the story is getting enough attention that they pay attention to it. Anyway, with that said, I'm done with the episode this week. I hope you enjoyed my fantastic guests, John Okar, Jakub Krawczynski. I'm not going to talk about I'm not going to power rank the U.S. news topics this week, corporate news, just because it's so soon after the last episode. Not much has changed, with the exception, obviously, of the court case. But what I will do is talk about the weird of the week. And so this week, it gets pretty weird. For those who are not familiar with U.S. politics, and in particular, the far right, I've mentioned in previous episodes the Build Back Better plan versus the infrastructure plan. And the infrastructure plan was a bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans agreed to a somewhat basic plan to help get roads built. I mean, important in a sense, but like not the kind of things that individuals will feel helping them alleviate their concerns economically about the current era we're living in with COVID and inflation and all that. The infrastructure plan passed, and the Build Back Better plan did not. And progressives wanted to couple the two of them so that they'd have to pass together, knowing that the infrastructure plan had more support from the center and the right. And so by having the infrastructure plan passed before the Build Back Better plan, it undermined efforts by progressives to make sure that the Build Back Better plan would be passed and that people would feel that direct aid from the government and maybe have a better impression of the current president, for example. But so what's occurred is that apparently in order to get the infrastructure bill passed and sort of circumvent the progressives, a number of Republicans joined sides with Democrats to get it passed. And for those Republicans, I think the idea was these bills were going to be passed. The numbers are there for Democrats. And so they could decouple them and impact the ability of progressives to fight for more, essentially. So they'd be handicapping real effective policy change on the part of the government, on the part of this president. So it was a tactical move. They maybe didn't support all the stuff in the infrastructure plan or didn't want to help that get passed, but they wanted to undercut, the left, essentially. And it's backfired. Trump called them out for helping the Democrats be socialists, be communists. And they have, Trump's supporters have gotten behind that claim, and they've been sending death threats to the Republicans. Now, the Republicans thought they were playing some sort of 4 or 5D chess where they were, playing games to sort of inflict hurt on their rivals. One case being Maliotakis is a representative of Staten Island, a conservative area in New York City, and she probably wanted to get AOC and like kind of stick the knife in a little bit. You're not going to get what you want. And in the end, she's now getting death threats from the far right, from her sort of theoretical base of her constituency, because she helped the communists get their way. So this week's weird. I'm not sure if it's the Republicans who thought they were being slick and are I guess underestimated the lack of intelligence in the far right of their base, or if the weird goes to that far right base that's attacking their own for trying to play some sort of tactical politics. But whoever it is, they are the combined award winners of this week's Weird of the Week. Very odd behavior. Death threats are always sort of weird and inappropriate in and of themselves, but it's extra weird given that they're attacking their own, just based off of, I assume, some sort of misunderstanding of why people were doing what. But yeah, there it is. That's my episode this week. Stay tuned for more. We will be back next week after a little break. When our regular scheduled episode should have dropped later this week. I'll try to have the Patreon set up for then, and you can hear the whole Matthew Miranda interview from the last episode. But until then, stay safe, folks, and peace out. Follow us on Twitter at LateStageTrib, TRIB, and follow myself at Sir_Writes_a lot. That's on Twitter. On Instagram, follow us at Late Stage Tribune, one word. And we'll see you around next week, folks. I hope you have a good one. And watch out for death threats from the far right, I suppose. I guess you'd have to be a Republican trying to harm the progressives to be in their line of fire at the moment. So maybe we're okay, folks. See you next week.